Okay. Welcome, everyone. I'm Zihan, the director of the Michigan-China Forum. This is the Michigan-China Forum 2021 Business Panel Tech Giants Antitrust Reflection. And right now, let's just begin our panel. Our panel host today is Mr. Cyrus Jensen.
Wonderful, everybody. I want to welcome you to today's event. I am very honored to be here today and very excited as we are actually going to be hosting this event live on Zoom. And also, this is being restreamed currently on my YouTube channel. So for those of you that regularly follow me on YouTube, I want to welcome you here, and we're going to have an amazing discussion over the next 2 hours. Now, my name is Cyrus Jensen. I'm originally from America. I'm the managing director of APP Marketing Solutions here in Vancouver, Canada. That is where I'm coming live at. And I'm very honored to bring in a very esteemed panel today to really have an interesting discussion. Our topic today is called Tech Giants and the Antitrust Reflection. Now, I'm going to give us a brief introduction, and then I'm going to introduce our panel, and then we're going to go from there. Now, as we saw in this opening video, in the past year, there have been many unexpected disruptions to the business world, including the political and economic crisis caused by COVID-19. However, despite diverse challenges by these traditional industries, there's been many leading tech players, in America, such as Google, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, and similar Chinese counterparts, Baidu, Alibaba, Tencent, have actually been able to make substantial profits over the last year. However, the continuous expansion of these tech giants have also caught the attention of antitrust agencies. Major economies around the world have all pushed for antitrust actions in the tech sector in 2020, creating some uncertainty ahead for the tech giants to keep up with their agendas. Now, today's business panel will focus on three distinct parts. The first part of our discussion is entitled The Mindset Behind the Tech Giants. And in this session, we will explore how tech giants in both the United States and China have developed their unique competitive advantages to compete in this new digital era. The second and the main part of our discussion is entitled Global Antitrust Wave in the Tech Field. And this is where we'll be focusing on antitrust laws and how they influence innovation and collaboration in the tech sector. Finally, we're going to be concluding our discussion today on collaborations between government agencies and big tech companies, and how this can stimulate a more sustainable market environment for the future. This is essentially what we're all about, connecting China and the United States, learning to work together as these amazing tech companies transform the very world that we live in. Now, give me a brief moment to introduce our panel. First is Mr. Andrew Foster. He is the head of Skadden's International Competition Practice for Asia Pacific. He advises on competition regimes around the globe, focusing on China, the EU, and the United States. Mr. Foster has represented multinational firms in international merger control, private litigation, and US and EU enforcement matters, including cartel and monopolization dominance investigations. Next, we have Professor Daniel Crane. He is the Frederick Paul Firth Senior Professor of Law at the University of Michigan. He has served as the Associate Dean for the Faculty and Research from 2013 to 2016. His study focuses on antitrust law and economic regulation. He is the author, editor of over 6 books and over 60 articles and book chapters on antitrust law. And he has represented many large corporate clients in antitrust matters, consulted for various governments and intergovernmental organizations, and presented at many conferences around the world on this matter. And finally is Dr. Jia Yuan. He is the director of the Research Center for Innovation and Competition Law at Sichuan University and senior counsel of the Tahota Law Firm. Dr. Yuan obtained his doctor's degree in the University of Bonn in Germany. He was mentored by Professor Daniel Zimmer, the director of the Institute of Commercial Law and Economic Law at the University of Bonn, former chairman of the German Monopoly Commission. Now, during his postdoctoral research in the UIBE, he was tutored by Professor Huang Yong, senior expert working for Anti-Monopoly Commission of the Chinese State Council. His study focused on competition law and intellectual property law, and Dr. Yuan has provided consultation to the Anti-Monopoly Bureau of the SAMR and delivered lectures to anti-monopoly practitioners in China. He operates the SCU Competition Review, which is one of the most influential antitrust media in China. For more than 10 years, Dr. Yuan has conducted deep research on antitrust law in the digital economy. Gentlemen, how are all of you doing today?
Very well, thank you.
Fantastic. I'm very much excited to be here today hosting this panel, and myself also be able to learn from all of you and your vast experience in here. Now, let me briefly introduce the first part of our panel, and this is going to be the mindset behind tech giants. As we know, tech giants do have an incredible advantage over smaller firms as they analyze an incredible amount of user data to enhance their algorithms and develop faster and more cutting-edge technology. Now, while traditional industries have declined and even laid off workers, many of these leading companies have expanded in the global market. So the goal with this first part of our discussion is to provide our audience with some background information related to these tech companies. And it is to allow our audience to understand what features of these tech giants have caused antitrust concerns. Now, my first question, and this is going to be to all three of you, we're going to start with Mr. Andrew Foster. Generally speaking, how do tech giants in the United States and China respectively build up their competitive advantages?
Well, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, all of the firms that you sort of mentioned in the beginning, the Googles and Amazons, Facebooks and Apples, or whether it's Baidu or Tencent, Alibaba, they all typically start with, one or two things that they're really known for. And, they begin to make a name, Google, obviously, for expertise in search, Facebook for expertise in social networking, Apple as predominantly as a design and manufacturer of consumer retail hardware. But, really what we have seen over, each of those companies' lives as they evolve is, even though they maintain and pursue excellence, maybe in that, in that one particular area that we most know them for, over time they've really come to they really come to expand, and as they grow, they all end up beginning to operate in the same sorts of industries. They all start to touch each other. They all start to converge. And so, what you'll see is, for example, a Google and an Amazon, they are not just the companies that you see, when you open your browser, when you go to the website, they also have enormous operations in terms of cloud services and in terms of web services. Google and Apple come into competition with each other because, they both become, sort of the standard bearers for different operating systems for, mobile devices or for consumer hardware. And so, that's another battlefront that opens up, as they expand their operations. You can think about Facebook the same way. Facebook and Apple don't have an obvious, competition set up head to head, but, as Facebook and social networks, expand into advertising, as that becomes, the real revenue driver there, then they will again bump up against Google, which does the same thing, and then very publicly now bump up against Apple, who in their latest OS are trying to take measures that may restrict Facebook's ability to to drive those types of revenues that they get from search. And so what we're seeing is companies that are really truly excellent at one thing, but they, by dint of their resources, by dint of their expertise, and more and more just by dint of their size, they begin to expand across the sort of across the entire landscape. We see them in almost every permutation of our life, and then they begin to touch each other. So sometimes it feels like we're almost surrounded by these giants.
That's fantastic. Yeah, that's a very good insight. How they start off with really one key business model, but as they're all expanding, you think of, for example, cloud services. Almost all of these now are offering cloud, and it is something that everybody needs. If you're a tech giant, you're going to be investing in cloud, and as that's going to be a big part of our world moving forward. Let's see, Professor Crane, would you like to add anything to that? How do tech giants in the U.S. and China respectively build up their competitive advantages?
Yeah, so I want to just really add on to what Andrew said by observing that as a competition lawyer, I'm trained to think about products. That's the way we sort of start and end our analysis in terms of what's competitive is this product or that product. But what Andrew's described is actually ecosystems, and that's much more an important way of understanding how these companies grow to the massive scale that they do. So if you sort of think about, let's take Apple and Amazon. They were never competitors. I mean, Apple was a device manufacturer for hardware, and Amazon was an online book retailer that became an online retailer for everything. But over time, of course, they're really growing within much wider ecosystems that come to converge at some point. And so in the mid 2010 timeframe, Amazon and Apple became bitter antagonists over ebooks, right? That was a moment where they sort of matched up. And Apple's intention with ebooks was never really to make money as an ebook seller. It was to make sure that their devices, really the iPad as a reader, gained market acceptance and sort of grew Apple's ecosystem. Whereas Amazon, although it sold the Kindle, a physical product, never made money on the Kindle, but sort of viewed Apple as an existential threat because Apple was going to sort of challenge Amazon's supremacy in this ecosystem. And so what you see over time is because of economies of scale, economies of scope, and particularly control of massive amounts of data, that these ecosystems continue to expand and they start converging and running into each other, right? So that in some sense is both the explanation for how these ecosystems grow and grow and grow seeming boundlessly, but also how a new kind of competition emerges, which is not just product to product competition, the way we sort of have traditionally imagined competition, but it's really competition to own and control and shape different ecosystems. And so I think that's the really interesting economic phenomenon that both explains how these companies continue to grow and, as Andrew said, sort of surround us, but it also really puts a point on the way we have to think about what competition means in a globe where it's not just ebook to ebook or reader to reader or search engine to search engine, but it's ecosystem to ecosystem and within ecosystems.
Fantastic, fantastic. But before we get on to the next point, I do want to mention one fact on here that we actually have a live simultaneous translation as well. So if you are watching this currently on Zoom, if you go on the bottom of your panel, you'll see a little box with a globe and it says interpretation. If you click on that, you can click to Chinese. We actually have live Chinese translation available. I forgot to mention that as well. One of the great features of today's panel. Obviously, we'll be speaking in English. If you prefer Chinese, I just got a message that I was speaking a little bit too fast, for the translator. So I'm going to slow down my speed. But that was fantastic insight, Professor Crane, as far as the ecosystems, and how that has really built up these and why they're surrounding us, right? And that's a big part of that. Dr. Yuan, what would you like to add to that about how these companies, maybe you can talk a little bit from the Chinese perspective, how these Chinese companies are building up their competitive advantage for the big tech giants in China?
Yeah, of course. I'd like to add one point because I'm agree with the ecosystem concept. As I understand, the tech giants in US and China do have similar approach to build up their strategic advantages because they have one common goal to build a digital ecosystem. For example, Alibaba and Amazon, they were understood as a big e-commerce platform. Tencent and Facebook were understood as social networks. Baidu and Google were understood as search engines. But now they have already operated in many other important services, such as cloud services, digital payment, online music, online videos, and digital games, and so on. So it's almost the same, but I don't think it's a coincidence. Yeah, it must be this. Because for these tech giants, number of users play a very important role in their business model. So they will try to get more user numbers through better and free service. At the developing stage, they normally need much more capitals to invest in these services. Once they get enough number of users, then it's time to get cash back through advertising or subscription fees. and leverage this advantage to other markets. And for the effect of winner takes all, so there is only one or two giants in one service market. Yeah, so their strategies are focusing on leveraging their advantages to enter into more and more related markets and to build up a digital ecosystem. So I think this is what they do and how they grow up to tech giants. Yeah.
Very, very good insights. And I think this was a very good way to open the panel here. All of you provided some great insights. And Mr. Foster, I loved how you started off saying, typically this tech giant would start off with one key feature. You think of Google as, okay, we're going to build a search engine. Facebook, we're going to have a social network. But as these, products continue to expand, now they become ecosystems, and they're all competing on the similar level. Like I gave the example with cloud. Everyone's pretty much investing in cloud. That's a big part of their business. You have these ecosystems, and even something like Amazon. Let's start selling books. Now we have Amazon Web Services and Amazon Cloud, and obviously let's sell everything we can in the world. And that's how Amazon has become so dominant. The other thing that Dr. Yuan added at the end, though, is that the big amounts of user data. And I think that's a great point that was going to lead us right into the second question that I have for this part of the lecture today. And that is, what role does having access to large amounts of user data and these advanced analytics play in increasing the tech giants' dominance? Again, we'll start with the same order. So we'll go with Mr. Foster, if you could comment on that.
Sure. I mean, and so, I think from the antitrust perspective, what we worry about is, Dr. Yuan, you spoke about a winner-take-all type arrangement. And so if you end up with digital platforms where, the world is effectively divided amongst a very few competitors, then, these competitors are, have an enormous amount of, enormous amount of ability to penetrate into our lives, into our homes, then obviously one of the byproducts of that is there is a significant amount of data that can be mined from that. User data, personal data, operational data, there's, everything is data, right? So there's just an enormous amount of it. The question from an antitrust perspective is, getting access to that data. Is it going to be proprietary? Are they going to be the only people who have access to that data? And is anyone else going to get to use it or share it? And one of the interesting things is, and maybe we don't need to really start talking about the antitrust law yet, but different jurisdictions think about that in very different ways. And, the obligations of the government to ensure that there is access to, something that might be considered an essential facility or something that you absolutely must have to compete. If you have something like that that gets locked up by only one or two players, then that becomes a way to potentially prevent competition, right? It becomes a way potentially to stop anyone from getting a foothold in your same business. And so, there's always a catch-22, because what you weigh that against is incentives for innovation and for improvement. Part of the winner-take-all argument, and one that's certainly always been one of Google's big sort of rebuttals of that, is they say competition is always a click away, right? It's always very easy for someone else to come out and design the next better widget, and whatever the next thing is, Google feels that it must always be improving. And so, they're using that data, they're using that resource to always innovate and to improve and to create better products. And so you have to weigh, so you weigh those two things. As Dr. Yuan mentioned, a lot of this is done for free at the beginning, right? So it's not necessarily costing consumers money. It becomes very difficult to weigh, how much do we want to encourage new and innovative products? How important is it to make sure everyone has access to this resource so that there can be more competition?
Very, very good points. Professor Crane, Can you add a little bit to that? What role does having access to large amounts of user data and these advanced analytics play in increasing these tech giants' dominance?
So I think that is a fighting issue, meaning that this is exactly what is going on in these big tech investigations and cases, is the question, how valuable is data and how much is having data an entry barrier to those who don't have it? So Hal Varian, who's the chief economist for Google and an academic economist also, makes the point that everyone has data. The question is, how smart are you at turning the data into a competitive advantage? And so from Google's perspective, as Andrew said, competition is always a click away. The reason people prefer Google over Bing is because it's a better search engine. And I think what Microsoft would say in response is, it's a better search engine because you have so much more data. So
Right.
that is, I think, really much a contestable question. I do think that data is certainly a competitive advantage. The Federal Trade Commission's case against Facebook right now, even thinking about Facebook's ability to make acquisitions, which is the sort of the heart of their case against Facebook. It's based on Facebook having so much data that allows them to anticipate which companies will become competitive threats down the road and buy them up before they become competitive threats. I think what Facebook or Google would answer to that is, well, having the data doesn't tell us who is a competitive threat. It's the analytics, it's the intelligence, it's the algorithms that we bring because of the investments that we've made in technology that allow us to figure out how this dynamic marketplace is progressing. And then the other thing, again, underlying what Andrew said, data is, if we think that data is a source of competitive advantage, it is also something that brings immense value to the consumer. I mean, think about what a Google or a Baidu give you for free at your fingertips. It's extraordinary. You know, when I was growing up, I didn't have a computer. And now on my phone, I have a universe of information for free, quote unquote, for free at my fingertips that in all of human experience, no one's ever had so quickly. If I'm in a new city and I want to figure out where to find a shoe repair store, in about 10 seconds, that data comes to me with the information when they're open and reviews on them. It's extraordinary, right? And now the cost of that, of course, is that it's not really free. And Tim Wu, who's President Biden's newly appointed sort of antitrust czar in the White House, Tim, he's an academic at Columbia Law School, but he has sort of made popular the idea of attention merchants and markets for attention. And his point is that we need to start thinking about the real cost of quote unquote free from the perspective of the attention that consumers are bringing to different platforms. Because of course, attention is what is commoditized as advertising dollars. It's eyeballs, it's attention. And so there's nothing is free, as sort of we know from economics. There's no such thing as a free lunch. So we're paying for it somehow. And the question is, are consumers paying for it in a way that actually gives them a good advantage back, or are they paying too high a price implicitly by the way in which they have to give over their attention, their data, their privacy, their security, and entrenching these platforms as ever bigger and stronger over time. So I don't have a great answer to the question, how important is data? We certainly know that data is a competitive advantage. Mm-hmm. Also know that data alone is dumb. It's just numbers, right? Until someone brings analytics, intelligence, processes, algorithms to it, it means nothing. And so it is, but this really is the heart, I think, of lots of these antitrust issues.
No, that's fantastic insights, Professor Crane. And I think the one thing that I took away from that is, everyone has data, but can you turn that data into something useful and powerful? I'm going to add some comments at the end, but let's go to Dr. Yuan and add a little bit of context from the Chinese perspective. And these Chinese firms, obviously, they have a large amount of data as well. Talk to us about how that's given them some, strategic advantage, for these tech companies in China.
Yeah, of course. We know that we have the almost the most people in our country. Yeah, so we do have a huge universe users data here in China, and I think large amounts of data about users' preferences and characteristics are very crucial to inform the creation of content that is better tailored to people's interests. Yeah, not only data itself, but also its quality, yeah, as well as for the development of more efficient products and services. It's very important. In other words, the use of big data by companies for the development of products and processes has the potential to generate substantial efficiency and productivity gains. It's useful for users. And with the development of data mining and machine learning, business are able to offer innovative, high quality, and customized products and services at low or zero prices, quote, yeah. Further, data could be used to better target advertising and generate artificial intelligence-based innovations. But under certain circumstances, we must notice that the collection and analysis of data could raise competition concerns. Since, for example, data can be a factor contributing to market power, and data can increase market transparency among suppliers and thereby facilitate collusion. And the data can be an instrument for certain anti-competitive conducts, since the availability of large amounts of information and special methods of processing can create additional incentives for cooperation of market participants, including through anti-competitive agreements for like cartels. Yeah, it's hard to find out and to against them. That's my point.
Yeah, very, very good insights. I think we're really establishing a good base, for how these tech companies have been, so dominant, how they've been growing, and how they have this competitive advantage. I've studied a lot, for example, TikTok, and why that's been so successful. Traditionally, search engines have always been that the user goes to the search engine and tries to put in data. What do you want to find? For Professor Crane said, okay, shoe repair store next to me. And what made TikTok so successful is they actually reversed that process. What if the search engine could actually, find content for you and have a recommendation engine? And I think one of the things that TikTok, for example, has been so successful is, their videos started out so short, being, 15 to 30 seconds long. So within a session, people were being able to watch, 10, 20, 30 videos. And depending if they just swiped away or if they watched it longer, they had a lot of data to really refine that algorithm. So I think that is what's also really important here with these very big tech companies, is they do have lots of amounts of data. And of course, they are, using that to get stronger because it's making the algorithms better, as AI powers the algorithms and make things more efficient. Everyone now is using a recommendation engine, right? And all of these social media platforms, even Amazon, how do we get people to come back? Oh, you watched, a cooking, you were looking for cooking things. Well, let me show you something related to cooking. All of this has, strategic advantage. Everything helps, these bigger companies get bigger. So very good. Now to close out this first section, I want to go for a specific question. And at the end of each section, I'm going to ask each of you one question individually. So for this section, we're going to ask Mr. Andrew Foster, a question based on international tech companies. And I'd like to know, from your experience, what have some of these international tech companies done to build their competitive advantage on the global market? If you would like to share some of perhaps your experience as you are in Hong Kong, working with many multinational companies, around the globe and in very different markets. If you could, give us some examples of that.
Sure. I mean, I have to be a little bit careful because a lot of these are clients. So I can't. Fair enough.
Fair enough. As best as you can.
Openly about the competitive edge and how they do it, but no, I mean, we've touched on it a lot here already, right? And I think maybe as Dr. Yuan was acknowledging in the very opening remarks, you take someone like Tencent, right? And, Weixin, they have the WeChat, which begins as a single function type product, and then you watch how that grows and becomes an ecosystem. And this is an area that, I think that Alibaba and Tencent, ByteDance have done even better than their US counterparts, creating this ecosystem where, all of a sudden, you have digital payments which tie into that in a seamless way. Cash is, almost almost no longer used. I go to Beijing and Shanghai, and if you don't have your phone, people just look at you strange if you try to pay with money anymore, right? I mean, everything builds off of whatever it is whatever that first product you have, and they create these enormous ecosystems which really come to touch on every part of your life, and so much of it is convenience, right? And we can talk about sort of winner take all, and you talk about the competitive edge, but it really has created enormous benefits for people. It's enormously innovative, the things that have been done, and it's very easy. Now, the part of that lulls us a little bit, as Dr. Crane referred to, you start thinking about the attention cost, right? And being trapped within an ecosystem. But those are the types of things, if you can build that kind of world where, the consumer has no reason to leave, does not want to leave, or if they think about other things they need, they're already right there, contained within the world. That's something that, I think in particular Tencent and Alibaba, ByteDance, those firms have been incredible at doing. And obviously, Facebook attempts to do the same thing, Apple to some degree, but I haven't seen that same level of success. So that's one of the things that I think has been just phenomenal to watch over the last 10 years.
Absolutely.
Things that people talk about, and this is something that maybe Professor Crane can also weigh in on, but you hear a lot about killer acquisitions, right? And that's that's sort of the dark shadow of what are they doing to maintain their competitive edge. Well, you get all this money, right? You've got these war chests of enormous amounts of cash, and then when you see people on the horizon that you think may be able to challenge you, you hear either anecdotally or it's reasonably hard to prove, right? I mean, there's been a few cases where transactions have been challenged on this, but usually these are things that fly under the radar. And you hear of the big firms, they'll see a product they think is really interesting, right? And then maybe they pay the founders, before it becomes commercialized, pay them $50 million or $100 million to buy it. It's not a product that yet creates revenue, so you're going to have almost no merger control required for things anywhere in the world. Merger control authorities trying to change that, right? They're retooling some of the thresholds maybe so that revenue isn't the sort of the most important thing. But then what you often see is that idea that that new product becomes dismantled. Maybe they dissect it and take pieces that they want and assimilate that into something that they are doing, or maybe they sideline it altogether. Maybe it just gets purchased, and then you move the employees into other to work on other projects, and the original project then can quietly die and will never challenge what you what you feared. That's both a horror story. It's one that I have heard from friends, in Silicon Valley, who say it does happen, right? They've seen it happen. They've been the people that, have been in there. But it's also, there's a real question about how often does it happen, and how easy is it to do, and is it a real world problem? And those are questions that I don't know. But that's sort of the when you think about the competitive edge, that's the dark side that I think sometimes we fear.
Yeah, very, very good insights. Very good insight. Professor Crane, did you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, so this is maybe jumping the gun a little bit, but to the point about killer acquisitions,
Yeah.
I agree that it's a real thing. the problem is that we also see the converse side, which is, so Facebook acquires WhatsApp and Instagram, and they become very successful. And the argument is, well, see, you acquire these companies that, but for your acquisition, would have become successful competitors to Facebook. And so it's almost damned if you do, damned if you don't. If you acquire them and they're not successful, then you kill them. If you acquire them and invest in them and they are successful, then it's, see, you shouldn't have acquired them because they would become your competitors. And so I do think that that strategic acquisitions, Cyrus, to your original question, what are the competitive things that these companies are doing? Acquisitions is a big piece of it, but it's just a little hard to know whether those acquisitions are harming competition or actually making for better investments and better products. The other thing that we haven't talked about so much is acquisitions of people. So talent and competition for talent is a huge issue, and maybe we should be focusing more on sort of the way in which these big tech platforms are hiring each other's employees or limiting each other's employees' ability to change companies. This is a growing issue in the United States today, which is anti-competitive restraints in labor markets, including in sort of anti-poaching, covenants not to compete, things of that nature. And so there's a hugely competitive market for the top talent, because again, it's not just the data, it's not just the technology, it's the human intelligence and competence that turns those things into the cutting edge products that we want to see in the market. So I think, yeah, acquisitions is a big piece of it, but it's acquisitions of company and also acquisitions of people.
Yeah, fantastic. That's really good insight. I know this was supposed to just be for Mr. Foster. I do want to give Dr. Yuan a chance. Would you like to add anything to that, Dr. Yuan, maybe from the Chinese side? I think the interesting one was this talent acquisition. I thought that was a very good point that Professor Crane brought up. Do you see that as well in China? Obviously very.
Okay, I'd like to add one point. It's a little different here, but I think the killer accusation also happened in China, and some big techs. I don't want to name them, but they do have these accusations in the past years. But I want to say that compare this Chinese big techs or tech giants with US companies. It's normally the Chinese big techs want to or has already acquired companies, startups, innovative startups, normally only in China or in Southeast Asia. But in the other parts of the world, normally only US tech giants are doing killer acquisitions. It's very interesting. But I want to address this in next part.
Absolutely. Well, that was a great way. So that concludes the first part. Again, we have 3 parts here in today's session. I think a very good introduction, setting the groundwork, for everybody listening in. And now we're going to move into part 2, which is entitled Global Antitrust Wave in the Tech Field. And again, this is the main part of our discussion today. And I think this is, again, will allow all of us to expand on some of the principles that we've introduced here. I'll briefly introduce this part for all of us now. And that is, in both the United States and China, the increasing advantages of the tech giants and their continuous expansion in both domestic and foreign markets have also caught the attention of antitrust agencies. For example, in the United States, the House Judiciary Committee released a 449-page technology antitrust investigation last October. And in China, the State Administration for Market Regulation also released a draft anti-monopoly guideline on the platform economy sector in November. We've also just seen recently, as of last month, new antitrust laws, coming up from Beijing as well. So this is certainly, a very pressing issue at the current moment, as both countries, United States and China, have pushed for antitrust actions in the tech sector in 2020. This does create some uncertainties, for these big tech giants moving forward. So we're going to allow everybody now to kind of dive deeper into our discussion on global antitrust laws and the relationship between tech giants and government agencies. So gentlemen, let me start with the first question of this section. And again, this will be to all three of you. We'll keep the same order. Mr. Foster, you'll go first. And this is, the US, China, the EU, they have all issued new antitrust legislation in the past year. What are some of the most distinct features among this new legislation, given the fact that, all of these three regions are very different from each other?
Yeah, well, I'll try to keep it reasonably brief so I don't step on the experts' toes here. But one thing that really, I spend most of my business advice really is China facing. So one of the things that has been just an enormous sea change over the last couple of years with China's anti-monopoly law is it really has been refocused and clarified to be clear that it will apply to digital platforms and to these large, sort of the large Baidu, Tencent, Alibabas of the world. For years, they had a bit of a free pass in China where, due to vagaries of corporate legal structure, they really were able to, I won't say evade, but avoid strict enforcement, antitrust enforcement. And, the anti-monopoly law is not very old. It, has only been around since 2008. And so obviously when you have a new regime come in, there's things you focus on first, which, hardcore cartel type work. And then obviously merger control has been a huge piece of the China antitrust enforcement. But in the last few years, there's been a real feeling in China that SAMR didn't want to be left behind by, the types of antitrust enforcement that were beginning to rise, particularly in Brussels, and then followed more recently by the rise in DC as well. And so now, I would say really for the first time, they have all the tools they need. SAMR as a regulator, maybe except for manpower, they have almost all the tools they need to really begin serious enforcement of digital platforms. And President Xi has just recently, last week, reconfirmed that this is going to be a huge strategic focus of China going forward. So, I think there's been kind of this open period where these giants grew up, but I think now China will very much be joining the rest of the world and really having a much firmer hand in using antitrust laws to shape how those companies operate and affect life in China.
Yeah, fantastic. Mr. Crane, what would you like to add to that?
Right. So maybe I can just make a point about the US and the EU, which is it's not so much a question of new legislation, but of enforcement ramping up. What's interesting is in the United States, if you go back to the year 2000, 2001, there was a big antitrust case against Microsoft that was in part successful. The government brought it and won most of the case and ended up settling with Microsoft for a consent decree. But after that, between say 2001 and today, there wasn't much government enforcement against big tech. There were, Apple eBooks case and a case against Intel, but certainly Google largely had a free pass. In fact, the Obama administration in 2013 looked at the question of Google search bias in Google native organic search and basically said what Google's doing in terms of integrating organic search with vertical search is beneficial to consumers. Mm-hmm. And so that sort of attitude, which is big tech is doing a lot of good for consumers, let's let them be effectively, was true until the last year in the United States. Now, Europe was very different. So Europe in the last 10 years, so first of all, they continued to go against Microsoft after the US stopped going against Microsoft. And then they picked up when sort of, as Microsoft faded a little bit and then Google came on the scene, Europe the European Commission became very aggressive in going after Google. And Google's up to what, over 10 billion euros in fines now. I kind of lost track of how many, just numbers at some point, like how many fines they've been hit with. And then Apple, right? Apple's come in the crossfire in Europe as well. So, and surely Amazon is not too far behind. So I think what's really happening comparing the US and Europe in the last year is the US is starting to catch up to Europe in terms of bringing aggressive enforcement actions. And we've seen multiple cases filed against Google, a major case against Facebook, and the prospect of cases against Amazon and Apple and others coming down the pike. So it's really a time period though of uncertainty, because these are lawsuits and investigations. There have not been court decisions in them yet. And in the US legal system, at least, the courts are the final word on this, and they do not simply rubber stamp what the agencies say in their cases. These will be hard-fought cases that could go on for a very long time. The Justice Department's case against IBM in the 1970s went on for over 10 years, and then finally the Justice Department abandoned it because it was just it was not going very well. And so we don't know the outcomes of these cases yet. But the big change, I think, from the US perspective is that the political attitudes towards enforcement against the big tech platforms have shifted. There is strong bipartisan support. It's an interesting coalition from sort of left to right of people being very concerned about the power of big tech and a willingness to bring these cases. What we don't know yet is how successful the cases will be.
Yeah, but definitely a change that's seen, in the United States, like you said, especially over the last year. And as we go to Dr. Yuan, I'd love for you to comment a little bit on China's situation. As Mr. Foster pointed out, just last week, President Xi did mention again that, China will be ramping up the antitrust. And I think that will be a very big part of China's tech industry moving forward. And certainly some people have even said it could be a competitive advantage because obviously China's government can certainly enforce things quicker and more effective than the United States government. There's not, obviously we know that. So to give us a little bit more perspective from the Chinese side.
Okay, I'm trying to explain this change. Yeah, because in past years, I think as everyone noted, the Chinese government or Chinese antitrust enforcer did not take very big step to stop the development of tech giants or platform companies. But in recent a few months, I think the time is changing, and China has taken significant steps to stop monopolistic behavior in platform economy. Yeah, this is only a guidelines about anti-monopoly law in platform economy, but many experts would call it against tech giants, because most tech giants are platform companies, very big platform companies. And the new regulations the new guidelines were enacted last month, and they are expected to punish companies from using anti-competitive technologies, using data or algorithm to exploit the market and to prevent price fixing or bundling such behaviors. The Chinese regulators have not yet outlined how harsh they will be in implementing these new anti-monopoly rules, although the penalties could range from blocking mergers and acquisitions to high fines. But now we didn't see this happen. Only very low high fines for the merger did not notify to SMAR. Yeah, and so it's very interesting to wait for next big case. Yeah, and I'm also waiting for this. Secondly, I'd like to add some point about EU. Because I studied in Europe, and I observed the antitrust law enforcement in EU closely. I think EU has taken the most strict antitrust order or competition law enforcement around the world. The EU has fined Google about 10 billion for antitrust violations in past years. It's about almost every market this search giants is working. For example, advertising, shopping, and mobile services. The EU has also charged Amazon for breaking its competition law by taking advantage of third-party sellers' data to profit itself, and has launched 2 antitrust investigations into Apple. So EU has done many, but I think the reason back it is EU didn't have its own big companies in tech industries. Yeah, they didn't have the chance to develop or to grow up as a European tech companies. So that's why EU has taken the strictest actions against the tech giants. And we must notice that the EU in last year, December, unveiled a landmark draft of Digital Service Act and Digital Markets Act. The 2 acts are against tech giants. We all know this. And the bundle of laws is part of the EU's larger mission to tackle the monopolistic behavior of global or US tech giants such as Amazon, Apple, Facebook, and Google. So we are all waiting for this new change, how this could be impact the behavior of the global tech giants. Yeah.
Yeah, fantastic. Well, gentlemen, that was a very good opening part to our second section here, talking about antitrust. I think as our entire world has changed very rapidly over the past 12 months, dealing with COVID-19, that has certainly fueled a very large digital transformation around the world. And I think this is why, as we've seen, tech companies, again, continuing to get bigger and stronger. Again, many of them, increasing their revenues, and still remaining very profitable, even despite COVID-19. And again, our world is shifting to very much digital. I think the big thing that we can really take away is that certainly antitrust is becoming more prominent in all markets. I think Dr. Yuan, you made a good point that the EU seems to have the strictest policies currently, although China will be, as President Xi has outlined, will be, making this a large part of their agenda moving forward. So I think this is something that, all tech companies are going to have to deal with, and this is going to be increasing in the future. So let's go to the next question. And this is going to be, again, to all 3 of you. And this is, as tech giants continue to expand their global footprint, what is the possibility of different countries cooperating in this process of antitrust law enforcement? Basically, how do you see this unfolding? Again, we'll start with Mr. Foster.
Well, I mean, the point to be made first and foremost is that the antitrust regulators and agencies already coordinate to a large extent. Particularly, or not particularly, first of all, with respect to cartel work, they're always very closely aligned. There's most mature countries with mature regulators have bilateral treaties or memoranda of understanding that permit or encourage cooperation, so they're always working together. In merger enforcement, I mean, we see every major case, SAMR in China wants to talk to the European Commission and the US agencies align very closely, not only on substance, but also on process and timing. That's true around the world. Now, the issue that you see, and will be particularly interesting with respect to looking at these sort of these big tech giants, is there are very real differences, in part in terms of who's allowed to operate in China outside of China, right? So, Google for example, does have a dominant position in China with respect to its Android iOS, but with respect to search, with respect to a lot of its expertise, it has almost no position at all. Facebook, the same thing, virtually no position at all. Apple is much less prominent in China than it is in the U.S., and so there may not be sort of identical one-to-one coordination in that way with respect to particular high-profile investigations at the moment. But I do think that there will be quite a lot of influence just in terms of discussion and know-how and meeting up. I think there will be some alignment there. One last point to make in that regard, though, is there's an allusion to some degree in Dr. Yuan. What Dr. Yuan was just saying, Europe, perceived to be so strict because it doesn't have anyone to protect, right? It doesn't have any of its own national champions. Every country has a different degree to which nationalism and protection of national champions creeps in to how they will set up their regulation. Some jurisdictions pretend that it doesn't touch things at all. Others, like China, for example, the anti-monopoly law, explicitly permits, some would say instructs, China to look at not only the impact of a transaction on the competitive landscape, but also you have to look at the impact of a transaction on the national economic development of China. So explicitly instructed to take into account industrial policy goals and those types of imperatives in China, where we have seen definitely over the last 10 years that have an enormous divergent effect is, China really uses its merger control process in a lot of ways to try to level a playing field it perceives to be unequal, where you do have these giant, US and often as well European companies doing these acquisitions. China asks, how does this help China, right? And that's something that the US and the US really doesn't do, and the EU pretends that it doesn't do. But China has a different mandate under its statute, and so even there, while there's cooperation, you're not going to have a pure alignment across all three jurisdictions into how they're going to approach each case.
Very good. Very good. Professor Crane.
So I think that's exactly right. And I think we're at a period of uncertainty about the degree to which we will see sort of technocratic convergence on competition law around the world, or instead it moving towards geopolitics, national champions, and trade wars. And I think the latter is maybe the more likely possibility. So if you think particularly about a domestic US case against a Google or a Facebook, and the question being, at the end of the day, let's suppose a court finds that they've violated the antitrust laws. And now the question is, what's the remedy? Do we break them up? Well, we broke up Standard Oil, we broke up AT&T, decades ago. Would we go so far as to break up, let's say, Google? And I think that would be a moment when, even if breaking up Google were the right answer from the perspective of, let's say, consumer welfare and competition, there will be immense political pushback to doing that because of the importance of Google being an American company that is that sort of projects American interests in many places around the world. Now, that's just a purely descriptive statement or a prediction, really. But I think that will be the moment when really the question will come down to a question of policy, and the policy question will not be just about competition law and the things that people in my little area of the world think about. It'll be about the national interest and how this plays in larger fights about intellectual property, international trade, the military, national security, data security, and all these things. I just think this is unavoidable. And so, although I would like to think that there will be ever increasing international cooperation among agencies, moving from these sort of, fairly informal bilateral cooperation and information sharing agreements to real international organizations that actually, have sort of technocratic expertise to make competition decisions, say on a merger on a global basis. I think we're very, very far from that. And the reason why is because we're in a world where there is obviously lots of just political hostility on a global basis. And it's hard for me to think that antitrust law will be immune from that.
Right. No, absolutely. Very, very good points. Dr. Yuan.
Okay. I would like not to put our discussion so political, yeah. But I think what I observed from the international practices, for example, the EU member states, UK, Australia, Japan, South Korea, and BRICS without China. These countries, because I've read many reports from their antitrust enforcers or professors. And in those reports, I've read that they do have similar concerns that they must confront with global tech giants and not domestic tech giants. Yeah, it's their factual concern. And so we must admit that they do not have their own tech giants. This point could make their standpoint more similar. And they may share more information about case clues and facts or harm of competition theories in order to enforce competition law aggressively to tech giants and to restore the competition in their local or national markets. Yeah. So as for the U.S. situation, I suppose U.S. government will also strengthen antitrust enforcement against tech giants now, but before some years they didn't do so. But now from 2020, I think it's a trend. But how deep it will be is questionable. Some experts may expect that the tech giants could be split into smaller companies, like AT&T or Standard Oils. But I think that would not happen in near future. Yeah. However, it will be much more harder to for tech giants to acquire innovative startups to expand its business. The U.S. antitrust enforcer will look more carefully into those acquisitions and reluctant to give green light in many cases. Of course, it will be even harder for Chinese tech giants to enter into American market, especially through M&A actions, because these acquisitions would be hard to get approval from U.S. government. As we just discussed, there is not only antitrust theories in merger control. Yeah, in some cases they must be take national security or such things into account. Yeah, and the U.S. antitrust authority may keep information exchange and cooperation with Chinese authority in merger control processes, especially in relation to Chinese big techs. And for China, I think in recent months, anti-monopoly became a popular concept in media and spread in common people because of some accidental events. Of course, it is the right time to update the anti-monopoly law to be suitable for new digital economy. The Chinese legislative body has already started the new legislation process for revision of anti-monopoly law. At the soonest, new anti-monopoly law will be published by the end of this year. During this period, the Chinese anti-monopoly authority may be interested in sharing more information with other competition authorities from other countries to know more about the harm of our competition theories in digital economy, especially how to assess the impact of global tech giants. I think that could be very useful for us. Thank you.
Absolutely, absolutely. Some very good points in this section, gentlemen. And I think I want to bring up just a couple things as we make this transition. I think it's interesting when we look at, for example, like you said, Google. I mean, it'd be really hard to see Google really being broken up. I think you would see a lot of political pushback. It might actually just make America look a little bit weaker in that sense if you're going to break up one of the most dominant companies. But maybe something that we talked about earlier, thinking about how the mergers and acquisitions, how that goes. Maybe there's some new laws that doesn't allow them to acquire these smaller companies. Maybe allow them to actually be a competitor, be a little bit more fair. Also, the talent acquisition. I thought that was a very good point put up because again, data and algorithms and AI is fantastic, but obviously it's the human brains behind all that as well, and managing talent. Maybe there's some new restrictions in there. And certainly we need to look at the political landscape because as Dr. Yuan pointed out, I think it will be very difficult for Chinese tech companies to enter into the US. We've saw, for example, TikTok, being potentially banned in the United States, and certainly some political things around that nature. So let's go ahead and go into the next question here. And again, this will be for all three of you. And let's talk about how do tech giants balance the need for business development and antitrust concerns. So kind of similar, I think this is right where we've been chatting about, but maybe we can talk a little bit about what could be some short-term goals and some long-term goals, for these big tech giants. Mr. Foster, we'll begin with you.
Well, it's interesting. I mean, in terms of antitrust concerns, and particularly, again, thinking about China, SAMR and MOFCOM before it really haven't before had the tools to really threaten major antitrust repercussions for anti-competitive behavior. And that is all about to change because with the amendments of the anti-monopoly law that Dr. Yuan was mentioning, one of the major things that we're going to see is an exponential or several orders of magnitude increase in the fine levels. And finally, SAMR is going to be able to levy the same types of fines that we see in the EU and in the US. So, we've already talked about the 10 billions of fines in euros that Google has paid. Intel had a $1 billion fine hung on them as well in the EU. We've never seen fines at that level in China. And so there's always been, there hasn't really been a need to balance business development versus antitrust concerns. So I think what we're going to see, already are seeing in terms of short-term strategies are, we've seen an enormous amount of, first of all, flurry of activity from SAMR. They're actively investigating. For example, Alibaba right now, they have published, on the order of 15 decisions for failures to notify transactions in the last couple weeks. And SAMR has been warning Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent that this is coming for years, right? This is not really a surprise. This is part of a long-term strategy. But, I think for a long time there wasn't, no one was really sure when and how public all of this enforcement would become. So, Alibaba and Tencent have hired antitrust experts, specialists, former government employees to really help them begin to evaluate how they are going to have to change. All that to be said, one of the great things about the anti-monopoly law, which I think was unclear when it was first put into place, was how important private litigation would be in China. So even though, maybe MOFCOM and then SAMR, weren't, really cracking the whip on Baidu, Alibaba, and Tencent in the early days, those companies have taken private litigation in China and really used that as a competitive tool themselves, right? And so we've seen most of the enforcement and at least where people rub up against the antitrust laws in China has been in civil cases between and amongst these companies. So it's not that they've had a total free pass, but I do think that what they are going to see in China this year, next year, is something unlike they've ever seen before, and I think they're definitely preparing for that. Now, I'm not sure that means they're going to change their product development, and I don't think it necessarily does, right? I think that they are now preparing, as the US companies did in Brussels 10 years ago. They are preparing for a storm, but I don't know that it really changed the way they operate. I guess we'll see.
Yeah, fantastic. Professor Crane, tell us a little bit, maybe some short and long-term strategies, for these companies as this antitrust concerns increase.
So I think in the short term, what they want to do is run out the clock for as long as possible on the antitrust side. Time is really on their side. That is to say, these cases take an awful long time to develop. They take an awful long time to litigate. There are appeals. And it could take many years before we have a final court decision that they've violated the antitrust laws already. And during that time period, a lot can change. For one, they remain dominant. They're continuing to earn very large revenues. And eventually, 5 years from now, the politics may have changed in important ways. The focus may have left this and beyond to something else. And also the technological and market conditions may have changed. One of the things about these markets is that they're very, very dynamic. And we talk about, these four companies, Google, Microsoft, Facebook, and Amazon, being so dominant, so important today. If you look at the history of market capitalism, the companies that were dominant in the middle of the 20th century are mostly out of business today. Even in the 1970s, most of those companies are out of business today, or they're marginalized. And so if you think about Microsoft in say the year 1995 or 2000, and this focus on the PC operating system as such an important platform, is this place that if you control the PC operating system, you control this whole ecosystem. Of course, that's fallen apart. The PC operating system is no longer a dominant platform that allows you to control the whole ecosystem. And so part of the strategy, I think, whether it's the short term or the long term, is just surviving the current antitrust onslaught such that the politics have changed and the technology has changed. And so, 5 or 7 years from now, there may be something entirely new that none of us has seen. Think about, Google was not the first search engine. Google was, it took its place in line after several other search engines fizzled out. And so who knows what will come to challenge or replace Google, not because of antitrust intervention, but because of the way the market itself operates and technological dynamism. So obviously that's, in some sense, that's an antitrust opportunity for these companies, which is to ride out the storm. But in the long run, that's also the business threat, which is how do you stay relevant and continue to be, the company that you are today when the world is changing so fast in terms of technology and politics and business and customer preferences. And so I guess my answer maybe betrays a bit of my skepticism about the need for such heavy-handed antitrust enforcement, which kind of assumes that if we don't do something from an antitrust perspective, then these companies will stay dominant perpetually. I just think that's very contrary to the history of capitalism, which is companies rise, companies fall, and that's all without respect to government intervention directly. I'm not saying that there isn't healthy government antitrust intervention. I'm just saying that from these companies' perspective, I think the bigger threat to them is not antitrust action. It's the fact that in the long run, they predictably, they're to face very existential challenges from technological innovation and social change.
Oh, absolutely. That's a very good insight as well. And You think back to, I saw a clip just the other day from 1999 when they were analyzing Amazon as a stock, and they just said, how could Amazon be the same market cap as Sears? Sears Roebuck. I mean, that is the fundamental American company. How could this possibly be valued at the same? And it was amazing to see, the people's minds on Wall Street 25 years ago. Obviously, we know Sears doesn't really have much of a presence anymore. Obviously, Amazon, incredible business. And even like you said, even with the Microsoft example, I mean, look at how much they've had to pivot and why they're still such an amazing company today, because they've changed and innovated with the times. Obviously, we look at a company like Kodak, who was dominant and then didn't choose to innovate with the times and, really suffered as a result. So I do agree with that analysis as well, that, things are changing and, we must always be trying to innovate and think of the next thing. Even though Google's dominating search, they didn't stop at search, right? They're going to try to do other, they're always innovating and expanding their operation as well. Dr. Yuan, bring us in some Chinese perspective on this, as these new tech giants, maybe some short-term and long-term goals, from the Chinese side.
Yeah, okay. I think the Chinese side, for example, the Alibaba and or Tencent or TypeDance, they all grew up from a very little company, and almost in the at the beginning of the 21st century, and as they grew up, I think they did a lot of right things because they want to to deliver innovative products or services to care more about consumers. But as the same with other tech giants in US or in global side, when they grew up as a very big one, big company, and to build up an ecosystem, so they have forgotten something because they didn't feel much more competition pressure from other competitors. So they slower their innovation. They didn't care much more about consumer. So from my point of view, it's very hard for tech giants to balance between business development and antitrust concerns now, because they are giants now. They are not only tech startups. They must give up some practices that may squeeze out competitors or restrain competition, even though they were used to it now. Yeah, the time for rapid or barbaric growth has passed. They should pay more attention and focus on innovation instead of restriction of competition. More care about end consumers instead of their own profits or market values. To maintain core services instead of entering into every market. I do believe the Schumpeter theory that only innovation is the best way to develop market economy, and the Freiburg economic theory that consumer welfare should be in the center of competition policy. That's what I would say.
Yeah, very good, very good. Gentlemen, we're running a little bit behind our schedule. I'm going to just fast forward here to the next question. This is going to be just for Professor Crane. We'll just let Professor Crane answer this so we can keep on our good pace here to make sure we can get in the entire session today. Professor Crane, how does geopolitical factors influence antitrust practice in both United States and China?
So I think I've already partly answered that question by saying that geopolitics is nominally not supposed to be part of it. I think Andrew said before that in the United States and China and the EU, there tends to be, at least the US and the EU, there tends to be this denial that we allow mergers to create national champions, that we use competition policy as an instrument of industrial policy or of national policy. Nonetheless, it is very clear that we can't hermetically seal competition law and policy from things that are happening globally. And so, for example, in the recent case brought by the Federal Trade Commission against Qualcomm concerning Qualcomm's alleged monopolization of various sort of chip technologies, and its noncompliance with promises to license its technology on fair, reasonable, non-discriminatory terms. The U.S. Antitrust Division actually came in the case in opposition to the Federal Trade Commission. So two sister agencies were fighting in court over the right resolution of that. And there's a lot going on in that case, but one of the things that was going on was the perception that Qualcomm, as an American company, was important to sort of national security and geopolitical interests. So again, those things have to be said with care, because officially we don't do that. But of course, if we're realistic, we do that, and everyone does that to some extent. And so as grown-ups here, I think we can say that it would be shocking. For example, we know that there are high-profile controversies between the United States and China over intellectual property. And antitrust law has a lot to do with intellectual property. Would it be reasonable to believe that that U.S. antitrust agencies or courts, in deciding questions about IP and antitrust, are not going to take into account the sort of the geopolitical value of U.S. intellectual property? So again, I'm not justifying that. I'm simply saying that from an American perspective, this is mostly confessional. I think it's unavoidable that these geopolitical considerations will creep in. It would be my hope that as much as possible we can keep those out, and that we can sort of think about the rule of law and objective standards and neutrality and growing the common pie around the world. But I would want that for trade policy as well, and that's not often been the case. And so I just think that if we're making a prediction here and being realistic, it's unavoidable that geopolitics will sometimes enter these discussions.
Absolutely. That's a fantastic answer. And I think it really leads us into the final part of our discussion here today, gentlemen, which is really going to be, what is next? What is next for this industry? So, after discussing the antitrust issues and the tech giants themselves, our focus now moves to the method for how these parties can collaborate with each other to construct a more sustainable market environment. And it is also our mission for this panel to potentially find some solutions to build a healthier relationship between tech giants and the antitrust agencies. All right, as we enter into this last section of our discussion today, we're going to begin with one question again. This is for all three of you. We'll start with Mr. Foster. And how do we define sustainability in the global tech industry? Besides government intervention measures, such as carrying out antitrust legislation, what else can be done to create a sustainable environment for all the players in the tech industry?
Well, as a good capitalist, I'll just echo Professor Crane. I don't think we want sustainability. We don't. Sustainability is. I think the last thing we want is to create a, sort of a static environment where everyone gets locked in, and you don't have people rise and fall. I mean, that's the whole point of competition law, right? Is to you have the rise and fall of competition and innovation. That's what drives people to hopefully, continue to be the great companies. And that's why we don't have the Kodaks and the Sears and Roebucks anymore. And, even Microsoft and IBM are completely reinvented from who they were 10 or 20 years ago. So, in terms of sustainability, there is this, I know we talk about this antitrust enforcement as sort of being a new flavor of the month, but someone who sort of watched the practice for 20 years, it's always, there's always a balance to be struck between, ensuring competition, how much intervention from the regulators is necessary to make sure that the wheels keep moving, right? And the US has traditionally been fairly hands-off with respect to that. The EU has been very interventionist. They think that they are, or at least they tell the world that they are, protecting competition and perhaps social order and consumer welfare by really, driving hard and inserting themselves into markets where the U.S. tends to say, well, these things tend to take care of themselves, right? We see market factors really being the most important here. So I'm not sure that there is a, I'm not sure there is an answer that creates a perfect harmonious measure. I think we do need to be careful, given the rise and the prominence of the digital platforms, that these ecosystems don't become locked in, right? We have to be sure, we have to watch carefully to be sure the market really can't be overcome, because there's always the prospect that you get so strong, you have so much resources, so much access to things, and the ability to lock others out with impunity. Well, then you can, in an anti-competitive way, hold on to that dominance. So, I think we'll see different approaches in the U.S., the EU, and China with respect to that. I think that there's different objectives there, but I think all of the regulators in those jurisdictions will, they want to preserve innovation, they want consumer welfare. And they'll, to some degree or not, keep nudging things along to make sure that, there does not become sort of this unbreakable, static dominance by the big companies. So,
yeah, I think that's a great answer, and I like your quote. We don't want sustainability because we want innovation. And I think that is very healthy in a market to have companies rise and fall, and we certainly don't want to be complacent, where companies just get locked in. Obviously, innovation is what fuels our world and what makes it better every day with these two new technologies and companies coming out. Professor Crane, share some insights with us on this matter.
So I just want to agree also that we don't want sustainability as locking in any particular company or technology. We want dynamism, we want investment, we want competition globally. I don't want to lock in American companies. I would be delighted to see a company from Kenya become the next big player in this world. That would surprise me and delight me. So I totally agree with that. But what I do think we do want in terms of sustainability is cultural sustainability and legal sustainability. And what I mean by that is we want rule of law, we want predictability, we want neutrality and objectivity. And one of the things that concerns me about the United States right now in some of the proposed antitrust legislation is giving much more discretionary power to the federal antitrust agencies. That sort of allows them to sort of tinker with this as a social experiment in a way that might not be reviewable by the courts. And so whether we're talking about China or the European Union or the United States or Kenya or anyone else in the world, what I would like to see is that a company operating in that area, that part of the world, that country, has an opportunity to know and understand what the rules are. And if it follows the rules, to know that it's not going to be affected, it's not going to be called into question by government authorities. And then if it breaks the rules, it will be called into question, and it'll be appropriately punished for that behavior. So again, to my last comments about the way in which geopolitics can affect all of this, one of the pernicious effects of making this political is that it does undermine this idea of the neutrality and objectivity of the rules published in advance with notice, so that people can operate in an environment and make their investment decisions knowing that if they follow the rules, they're okay in that area. So I would like to see that kind of sustainability, which is sort of the legal and political infrastructure of the world becoming a level playing field, so that a company from somewhere else can come to the United States, a company from China can come to the United States, and know that if they follow the rules here, they make their investments here, they grow a business here, that they are protected. And the same thing should be true reciprocally around the world.
Very good points. Dr. Yuan, give us a little bit perspective from the Chinese side on this sustainability in the tech industry.
First of all, I would say the digitalized economy is an inevitable trend. It's important to maintain good environment for innovation and competition in digital economy. Of course, fair competition does not mean every market participant should be equally the same size. Some tech giants could take use of its advantages in capital, technology, and talents to invent and provide new products and services. What should be done is to prevent them from misusing its advantages. So besides the antitrust law legislation or enforcement, there could be a more efficient way to maintain sustainability environment for all tech players, which is to shape new regulation orders in tech industries, especially in relation to big data and AI industry. These industries are like water, electricity, and gas. They are in infrastructures. Yeah, many countries have established network industry regulation department or bureau. It could be a way to establish similar regulation authority, which could be responsible for create a sustainable environment for tech players. As I know, Germany, UK, and the EU already started to do so to regulate tech industries or digital economy. I think there could be more efficient regulation framework established in important digital economic countries. Second, I would say give another very interesting suggestion.
Mhm.
That could be create a new competitor for tech giants. We know that there are two kinds of tech giants around the world. One is American giants, one is Chinese giants, but they normally do not compete directly with each other. The Chinese tech giants normally focus on its domestic markets in China, and the American tech giants could expand its business all outside Chinese market. For those countries which do not have one dominant company in core service like e-commerce, social networks, why not consider to bring in Alibaba to compete with Amazon, bring in Tencent to compete with Facebook, and help Baidu to compete with Google. The competitive pressure could be useful to prevent the tech giants to abuse its market power and to assure the sustainability of tech industry.
Yeah, very, very good points there. I like the last point there, specifically talking about how, American companies typically obviously focus on the domestic market and, everywhere outside of China, as they expand around the world. And predominantly we've seen, Chinese companies very much just dominate the domestic market in China. I think, the earlier example that I brought up with TikTok and its parent company ByteDance, I think has really been a game changer. And something that we should be monitoring, because ByteDance, has been so successful. The founder of ByteDance very much had a global vision for the company. I think he was very innovative, saying, we don't want to just be another Chinese social platform. And I think it was quite interesting to see how they've penetrated so well into the Western market, really being the first Chinese tech company to just dominate and really, grab some of that market share. And it was interesting as well for me to note that, when the first, policies from the US government coming out saying, we should ban TikTok, I think I saw a poll with 70% of TikTok users in the United States didn't even realize it was Chinese, because the technology was so good, because it looked like it came right out of Silicon Valley. It was such a great product design. But I would love to see that, because I think, there's innovation coming from all over the world. We've mentioned earlier in this chat, for example, Mr. Foster, when you go to Beijing or Shanghai, it very much in China is a cashless society now. It is, they're moving far ahead. I've had some guests on my show before talking about, digital marketing and the digital economy. China's 5-10 years ahead of anywhere else in the world. So I think, and this is something that I always preach, on my YouTube channel as I talk about the United States and China, is the fact that I think the partnership between both countries is great, because there's so much technology coming from both sides, from both countries, and I think if we can learn to cooperate and certainly have, like Mr. Foster, Professor Crane said, rule of law, objectivity, having these important elements in with antitrust, and also allowing potential new players to come up. It'd be great to have some new companies like the Kenya example. Something from another country to come up. And again, competition is what makes our countries better, and it's what drives our digital economy that of course will be the future of our world. So fantastic, gentlemen, very good discussion here. And we are going to now we're going to go into the final question for today. And this is for Dr. Yuan, but I'm gonna open it up for all three of us. We have a little extra time now. We've been very efficient in our time. So why don't we just keep our same order and we'll just go through all three. I think that would be really good. This is a good question that we've kind of hit on before, but I'm gonna ask it again. As we've talked about this, it's for smaller tech companies that are starting out. They potentially could be intimidated by these tech giants and their dominant positions. And what approach can we sustain a healthy relationship between these tech giants and tech startups in the future? I think we kind of touched about this before, but just give you an opportunity to add any additional comments you'd like on that. We'll start with you, Mr. Foster.
Well, it's a great question. I mean, I think what you see in the real world is that people, they come up with these ideas. They want to, you come up with an innovative idea, an innovative company, an innovative product. Often they want that M&A, right? And particularly as they look to get funding from financial investors, everyone's looking for the exit strategy. You don't come up with a new idea and think, well, I'm going to drive this product to become the next competitor to Tencent or Google. You think, how is the best, how do I get the best resources to support my product and move it into those ecosystems? If you start to really over enforce, against that type of M&A, I think there's a very, very serious risk that you significantly chill innovation because, people will be less motivated to come up with those types of ideas if they don't think they're going to be rewarded for them, if they don't think they're going to be able to, place them into an ecosystem and have the support from larger players. And, you're also going to have less support from private investors who, always are looking for the best, way to get a return on their money if they don't see, an opportunity other than, well, this is going to, you're going to be the next, giant yourself. You're not going to get the same investment and interest that will help you develop that, idea that you have. And so, to some degree, this goes back to what Professor Crane was saying. You set up almost an impossible catch-22. Would Instagram have become Instagram? If it hadn't been bought? What about the ghost companies we'll never know about because they've been purchased and killed? I think at the moment the antitrust enforcement agencies are doing a pretty good job. I know some people doubt that, and it's hard to quantify, but these guys and girls are really good. They're really good at their jobs. They really do. They want to protect innovation, and they also understand how the economy works, right? So, I think that right now, the U.S. antitrust enforcement agencies and SAMR and the EU, they have an enormously high level of expertise. I think they are pretty good at drawing those lines and finding the right line. I think we're in a pretty good place right now. So.
Yeah, very, very good insights there. And I think you brought up a good point as well of, it is a great motivation, and I think for these smaller companies, to have, the chance, okay, one day we can get, what is the exit strategy? Maybe one day we can get a big payoff. It's not about, I want to create the next Google, but it's like, let's create something very innovative that could potentially be acquired. And that certainly is a huge motivation. And that does drive, innovation as well for these young entrepreneurs. Professor Crane, turn to you.
Yeah, so I agree with what Andrew just said, that if you put a very strong line against acquisitions by big tech platforms, it actually creates entry barriers for small tech startups because of the financing side of it. Because who's going to finance a small company to start up and have to compete head to head against Google forever, right? At least the possibility of acquisition creates an ecosystem where more companies are being sponsored and starting up. So although I do think that we need to take a closer look at the killer acquisitions question, and even beyond killer acquisitions, questions about whether merger policy has been too lax in big tech, particularly thinking about predictions about innovation. So I think we need to retool our merger control tools there. But the other sort of policy lever that we have is sort of what's called abusive dominance in most of the world, or monopolization in the United States, which is, okay, so if these companies are not going to be acquired, what are the rules for them to be able to play in competition with the dominant platforms? And again, there I'm open to the need to sort of retool some of those things. I don't think we're terribly far off today from where we should be. But I think it's sort of it's as Andrew said, it's thinking about the competence of these antitrust agencies and the courts to simultaneously be retooling the merger control pieces of it, the M&A pieces of it, and the abusive dominance or monopolization pieces of it, so that we create an environment where people are interested in innovating, where capital is flowing to interesting startup ideas. They're not prohibited from being acquired if they're a good fit for one of the dominant companies already. But we look at that hard and ask the questions about innovation and competition. But also, if they're not going to be acquired, or during their sort of nascent period, we take a look at the rules governing how the dominant platforms have to compete with them, and what they can and can't do that might put these companies into bankruptcy or prevent them from developing.
Yeah, very good, very good insights. Dr. Yuan, share with us a little bit of perspective, for these smaller tech companies, competing with the larger tech companies in China specifically.
Yeah, I would say in the past decade or 10 years, only a few small companies can survive without relying on big tech, not only in China, but also in other parts of the world, I think. Yeah. So it's very hard to get funds or talent or technologies from big techs. So they must be acquired by tech giants. But now I think the trend is changed, and there are signs that the government could, upon the large tech companies, could on their smaller partners or competitors. So, for example, the FTC last year announced it was examining every acquisition that Facebook, Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, and Google made over the past decade. Yeah. So Google has already cut back on new acquisitions in light of the Justice Department lawsuit. And the same for China. The Chinese SAMR has already published cases that acquisitions done by tech giants like Alibaba, Tencent, Baidu, and Meituan received fines for that they did not notify by the competition authority. It's a sign, yeah? And the enforcement and the merger control will be more strictly in relation to the accusation between tech giants and the startup companies. From now on, there will be less aggressive M&A strategy for those tech giants, because they will confront more strict anti-monopoly review. If it is so, then there will be more and more innovative SMEs could develop independently and have the chance to become new tech giants. In addition to my last suggestion, bringing more tech giants to compete directly with other in-position tech giants, I would say it is also very important to support innovative startups to keep independence of tech giants. We should give them more chance to develop new products or services. The development of 5G or 6G, Internet of Things, AI, could be a very good chance for new companies to grow up to new giants. I think it's a very exciting thing I'm looking forward to see in the future. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I think, gentlemen, that concludes, the bulk part of our discussion today. And before we move on to a couple of questions that we've received from the audience, I'll just give a brief little recap, from everything that I've learned today. I think, one of the things that I think is amazing is obviously the past 12 months has changed the world. COVID-19 has certainly had its effect. It has really accelerated digital transformation not only in the United States and China, but everywhere around the world. And I think, we've seen that with these tech giants becoming, stronger. I think antitrust is going to be, a very big issue moving forward. We see, all, the EU, China, the United States, all ramping up their antitrust measures. That will be a large part of that. But Professor Crane, you brought up a very good point, saying that time is on the side. These things do take a long time, a lot of litigation, a long process, to really get through that. But finally, I think as we're talking about, working together, this is a very exciting time to be alive. Obviously technology is changing our lives for the better. And again, I'm very excited as someone that studies both China and the United States. I'm fascinated by the new tech that is coming out, that is making our world, more, better and more faster and efficient. Zoom today that we're using, obviously been a great technology that has become just a household name now, because of COVID. So it's really an exciting time. And I have a couple of questions that I've received from the audience that I think are quite interesting, and I think would be a great way to finish our discussion today. A lot of it, I think for certainly all three of you, very established in your respective fields, and have a lot of experience with many big companies and these very complicated litigation and, processes. But how does, somebody asked the question, how does antitrust actions affect the user end or the customer end experience? What does all of this mean for, the average person, and how they're interacting with their tech companies and stuff like that? How is this going to affect the average person's life? Mr. Foster, we'll begin with you.
That's a great question. In some ways, the enforcement agencies often, when they do retrospectives and look back at what they've done in the past, they try to quantify those exact type of things. And we've had major enforcement actions for Google, and before that, Intel, Microsoft. The actual day-to-day impact on most people's lives, i.e. not antitrust lawyers or law students, is probably not that big, right? I mean, you might encounter more prompts when you buy a device to, download, have an option to download things onto your phone rather than having them preloaded, or, we may see, certain behavior. I mean, we'll see how aggressive the European Commission gets with the Digital Markets Act, but, we may see, may begin to see people, not having the same types of search results. When you search, often, the things we might think of as convenient, where, if you search for a shoe repair shop in, Slovenia, and comes up with reviews and suggestions and all that, some of that might start to again be separated back out. Obviously, there's been a long-running fight which is coming to a head now in many countries about how much we'll get in terms of news content when we do searches, and do we, will you still have the ability, or will you have the ability on Google or on Facebook to, to see, those types of content for free? Is it going to have to be, are they going to have to pay for it? Will that change your experience? Currently we have a different answer in Australia than we do in France, and eventually there'll probably be some harmonization. But I think for the most part there won't be a huge impact on the day-to-day life. The place where really you have the questions is, will we still see the innovation, right? Because the innovation is what benefits everybody right now. Will we still see the rise and fall of companies? What we don't want is to get stuck with, these big companies, and there's no more rising and falling, and, innovation starts to fall away. I think as long as, as long as governments don't become so interventionist that they start to hamper that type of innovation, most people probably won't notice. That doesn't mean it's not important. I think these are incredibly important questions. But thinking about it, just when you're having your morning coffee, looking at your phone, it may not be, the huge impact from day to day.
Oh, good insight. Very good insight. So, Professor Crane, would you like to add anything to that?
Sure. I just think that the thing that's on the side of the tech companies here is that if we imagine changes to the consumer experience or the customer experience in the short run because of antitrust, they're almost all negative to the consumer. And so you imagine that that the antitrust agencies, for example, require Google to stop making search free, or to change the structuring of the Google One box to take out all Google vertical search from that. And overnight, you would see a real impairment of the consumer search experience. Now, that might be justified by the long run interest in creating innovation. And the answer might be, okay, we're not going to let Google do some things in the short run that stymie innovation and competition in the long run. But it's a bit of a hard message to sell to the average consumer who's very reliant on the technology. When you look at surveys of consumers and citizens at large about big tech, they purport to be very concerned about big tech's power and so forth. But then if you ask them about the technologies that they use, so how do you feel about Facebook? Well, if they're an intensive Facebook user, they love Facebook, or Google user, they love Google, or Amazon. Who doesn't like free 2-day delivery on Prime? That's another example. You tell Amazon you can't bundle in a way that allows 2-day free delivery on Prime. I mean, people would be very upset with that. So again, I think the challenge here is that in the short run, these companies are doing things that feel, at least to the consumer, like massively beneficial things. And if we made them change, that would feel quite negative. In the long run, would it create more competition and innovation? Maybe it would, but that's going to show up down the pike. And I think that's the central political challenge in enforcing the antitrust laws in ways that would really impair their ability to continue offering consumers these high value propositions.
Fantastic insights, I think. I think on the basic consumer level, we just want more convenience, right? More convenience, make it easier for me, make my life better, right? Which is what, obviously tech companies are trying to do as well. Dr. Yuan, would you like to add anything from that, from like antitrust issues and from a customer perspective? How about customers in China? How would that affect them in their perspective?
I would say the consumer is a central concept in antitrust law series. No matter in US, in EU, or in China, we do put this consumer protection or consumer welfare into a value of or goal of antitrust law. So I think through the litigation or enforcement of antitrust law, we could make the competitive pressure to tech giants, to big companies, and then they could use their technologies or their data, everything to get more consumer or users, and they will give us more beneficial. So I think the consumer maybe they should stand up and find out more behavior they felt forced to do so. That's the typical misuse or abuse of dominance in antitrust law theory. For example, when the user forced to pay for a service that he didn't want, that's happened in China. I guess also in other world, in platform economy, and sometimes there are boundary strategy or a high price for some low quality products or or services if the provider is a dominant company. So we want to protect consumer or consumers, or to promote consumer welfare through antitrust law enforcement. On the other hand, I think the innovation is also a very central concept, because to assure innovation or to promote innovation could benefit consumers and the consumers also. And we can get much better products or service, much more convenient. So to to protect or to promote innovation through antitrust law enforcement. It's also a very good effect. Yeah.
Fantastic, fantastic question. Gentlemen, I have time for one more question, and this is actually a question directly for Professor Crane. So I'm going to ask you, Professor. Somebody writes, Professor Crane, I would like to work for one of the big tech companies. That is my goal after graduation. Is there anything about these companies themselves or their related antitrust issues that I should be paying attention to as I, start my career in this path?
Wow, that's a good question. I think these are all wonderful companies. They all have their issues, of course. They're not perfect. Companies are just collections of people, and people are not perfect. But I think, if the question is the antitrust risk to any of these companies, I think they all have significant antitrust risk. I don't think right now it's existential risk. I don't think antitrust is to put any of them out of business. It will require them to change their business model to some extent. But as I said before, I think the bigger issue is how do you predict the market will evolve? And if you know the answer, then you're going to become very rich. And I don't worry which company you're going to work for.
Yeah.
But you need to make a prediction about what current of change you want to be part of. And do you think that we're moving technologically and socially from a business perspective in a particular direction? And again, I think that if you look at these 4 companies that are so dominant today, it is very likely in 20 years' time that 2 of them will be like bankrupt and 1 of them will be marginalized. Maybe 1 will still be dominant. I think it's just the history of capitalism that's almost inevitable. And so make your prediction. Which one do you think is moving in a direction where, given trends in the world, they will continue to add value and to innovate their way through the next years of your career? But if I knew the answer to that question, I would be rich.
Yeah, that's a very good perspective. Very good perspective. Well, gentlemen, we reached the end of our seminar today, and today was fantastic. I certainly learned a lot as well. I want to thank everybody who's tuned in through Zoom, and also everybody that's tuned in on my personal YouTube channel that's also been streaming this event. Mr. Foster, thank you so much for joining us this evening for you in Hong Kong. And Professor Crane, great insights from all of you. Dr. Yuan, thank you for sharing your perspective as well. And I also want to give a quick shout out to Amy Yu, who has been interpreting this. This is a tremendous job to be interpreting for 2 hours straight on very complex topics like this. So Amy, thank you for your hard work as well. I want to thank you all for giving me the chance to host and moderate this. It's been an absolute pleasure to be here with all of you today. And for the final closing, I'm going to turn it back over to Zihan. And thank you, Zihan, for all your help today. Oh, he doesn't have his mic on. Hold on. I'm going to try to send him a message here, everyone.
Hi.
There we go.
Yeah,
Okay.
thank you, Mr. Jensen. Thank you, Professor Yuan and Professor Crane, Mr. Foster. Thank you not so much for participating. Your opinions are of great value to Michigan-China Forum. And this is our after panel server link. If you do not mind, could you please just take 1 or 2 minutes to fill it out, which is of great value to us. We also incorporate the link in the chat room, and everyone in the Zoom can just click on the link and fill this survey. Yeah. And please note that we also have 2 more panels. One is Sino-US panel, the Grand Chase Schemes, which will be from 8 p.m. to 10 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time, March 26th. Another is Healthcare panel, Digital Health Solutions in the post-pandemic era, which will be from 9 a.m. to 11 a.m. Eastern Daylight Time, March 27th. And finally, thank you so much again. Thank you so much for everyone's participating, and hope everyone have a great day. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. See you.
See you next time.
See you next time.